Welcome to the Haptic Composer 2 beta. In this video, I will walk you through to all the features of the Haptic Composer 2 from a haptic designer perspective. So when you open a Haptic Composer, you're welcomed by this page. This page, you will be able to create a new haptic material or open an existing project. Haptic materials are the haptic assets that you will use in your game or application to create a haptic experience. Let's make a new haptic material. After clicking the new haptic material, you will be able to give you a title, let's call it beta, and you will be able to decide where to save it. In this case, let's save it in the desktop and save the folder. You can then decide if designing your haptics with a standard or advanced profile. Standard profile are amplitude modulation devices. Most of the current haptic market uses standard profiles like Android phones, iPhone, Vive, SensiGlobe, or everything in XR specifically. Advanced HD haptics is mostly for PS5 DualSense controller, other audio-based haptics devices, and advanced developer kits. Let's start with standard, and we'll see later on how to design for advanced. When we start, we are welcome with our design space. We have on the bottom left our haptic materials, which are the assets that we are currently modifying. We can open or create a new material. We'll see them later on how to do that. Top left, we have our node presets. We will see the use during the design. Then we have the perceptions. Here on the top right, perceptions are like textures, vibration, and stiffnesses, which identify the kind of haptics that we are designing. And then we have the settings. Let's kick start here. Let's add the perception, and we decided to do a vibrotactile signal, which is one of the most used. So we are welcomed by a really familiar timeline system. And in this case, we have our main view and our slider, which identifies where we are in our timeline. On the bottom, we see the rendering of our haptics in a visual form. Let's kick off. We have on the left our node presets, and we start with that one. So let's open the node presets for application UI. We have different node presets that we can simply drag and drop into our timeline. And what happens? It happens that we have fundamentally each node presets have a different haptics experience, and it gets dropped at the time where our cursor is. Let's take a second one, like a double click, and it gets dropped at a specific space. What are you seeing here are haptic nodes, which are fundamentally unique representation of a haptic experience defined by functions. So it's really easy to manipulate haptic nodes. You can basically drag and drop them on your timeline. You can stitch them together just by gluing them. You can select it and move them around, or we can even select it through control and move them all together in other timelines. We can also decide to add an empty node from the Add Node button on the top right. And at this stage, we can also decide fundamental. If we want, all of the usual control for design works, and you can basically just manipulate nodes pretty much like you do in other well-known design programs. If you select it and click on the right, you can decide to cut, copy, edit, or delete. Delete. You can also use the delete button to delete our haptic presets and our haptic node. Let's take another haptic node. Let's say beat drum from our beat and music presets, and we have this experience. How can we test if we like the experience? We can simply click here, send it to player on the haptic material. This is the InterHaptics Player application. With this application, we can test the haptic design on mobile. To test it, just click on Experiment on the top of the application. We can test vibrations, textures, and stiffnesses. With vibration, we simply click on the plus button on the bottom, and we can synchronize with our own material that we design in the composer. We can simply click again plus when we did some modification with the new material on the bottom, and we can test the bottom and the top material, so iterating simply our design and modification. Of course, the actual experience that you will be deliver is the one is the output on the bottom. So if you add multiple haptic nodes, like in this case, you will feel the output that is the global experience that you see on your screen. If you move it, and then with Ctrl S, you save your material and you send it to the player, you will be able to feel the updated experience. So it's really, really easy to iterate on your haptic experience. So let's imagine that you are really not happy on how this haptic node feels. How can you modify it? Simply by double-clicking on this haptic node, you will have a graphical user interface that allows you to modify the behavior. You can put it in full screen and having a much better control on what's going on. On your top, you have the, in this case, seconds, because we are in vibrotactile signal. So you'll be able to precisely define how it is the behavior of your haptics. So this is the animation curve. What you can do? We have the concept of keyframe here that are basically points that your function needs to pass through, and you can simply drag and drop them around and define their tangent to create the final experience. Let's say that you are really, really not happy about this, and we wanted to start fundamentally from scratch. So in this case, you have the first keyframe, and let's imagine that we want to do a really sharp click. So we kill all of our keyframes. And a really sharp click is usually defined by starting directly from 1 at the time 0. So let's put by selecting our keyframe, we go on the top right, implement 1. And we see directly at our position goes to the specific space. Then we create a second keyframe. And a sharp click, it's something which is around 20, 25, or 30 milliseconds. In this case, we were precise enough, and we were 25. If we want to be more precise, we can simply zoom and check really well our function. We did then to create it to force our function to go down. So we create another keyframe, and we put it at 26 milliseconds, 0.026. And we put it, and we input a 0 position. So at this stage, we see that we really have this really nice sharp click that is well represented. But how does it look with all the rest of the experience? We really see it here. So when you close your edit your node, your material is being saved, your node is there, and you can go and zoom and check exactly that you have a really sharp click at the beginning of your experience. If you send it to your player, you will be able to check how the experience feels. If you're happy with that, and maybe you want to create a rhythm out of it and position it and create a multiple nodes, so to create let's say a beating experience, you can simply fundamentally select one, move it around, and glue it. So we can select 2, copy them, we take our timeline, and we paste them. So we have multiple nodes that we can simply move around. Fantastic. This is some of the actions that you can do. Let's imagine that we make it our node longer, right? So if we are using well-known design strategies, in this case, we select our node and we basically drag and drop it to make it longer. And you can also select, by selecting it on the settings right, we can define precisely the length of our node. In this case, let's say 1 second. So as you see, the haptics within inside get stretched, so we maintain design intention within the length. So you can really simply adjust and understand how your experience evolved. Fantastic. Right now, we checked that we understood all the basics. Let's go back to our edit node here. So we discussed about the keyframes. We also have the pattern amplitude modulation. What is the pattern amplitude modulation? We can select a mathematical function which allows to modify and modulate the amplitude. Let's select, for example, a square signal. What is interesting here is that we have a lot of shortcut and design strategies on the design space to be faster. So if we drag and drop from top to bottom, we see that we modify the amplitude. And let's generate like 0.5 amplitude. And if you drag from left to right, you're fundamentally increasing the frequency. As you see, dragging left to right or right to left changes the frequency. So it's really easy to create a multiple pattern. And top to bottom, we change the amplitude. We can also modulate the offset by clicking Control and drag on top to bottom, so we can generate this kind of behavior. And with control, drag and drop left and right, we change the phase of our pattern. So this is a different way to design haptics. It is really, really powerful when we want repetitive patterns and we don't want to design the real behavior of this repetitive pattern. We have some of them within our presets. For example, we have our pulse slow. That is a repetitive pattern that we can see really well here. So, and this is one example. So this is for the standard design. Let's go to the advanced design. So you always can change the your project to advanced and standard on the project settings. As you see, if you design it in standard, it stays as standard, and if you design it in advanced, it gets converted to standard. So let's create a new material here. We make Control N, create a new material. Let's call it beta advanced, and we save it, still save it in our desktop, and we create it in advanced. It's really exactly, basically the same design space. We create a vibration, we add our node. However, when we go to edit node, we have many more controls. Specifically, we have our amplitude modulation that modulates a carrier signal. Carrier signal is the flavor, let's say the frequency and the flavor of your haptic node. Let's imagine that we go, we create a sinusoidal shape here, and we go to a frequency of, let's say, 40 Hertz. So we see here really our nice and carrier signal that is at 40 Hertz, right? So we can zoom, so we see how it evolves. But of course, we have an amplitude modulation which is 0, so the ending result is 0. Just by adding keyframes here, we can go and modulate easily the behavior of the haptics through keyframes and generating the haptics that we are looking for your experience. Of course, everything that we saw before, like patterns, applies. So if we do a square wave modulation and we drag and drop, we see really well the behavior. In this case, amplitude modulation can go to negative and change the phase of our final haptic signal. So the offset that we saw before, it becomes really useful to being able to generate the pattern that we want. At this stage, just by increasing the frequency, we can see that we can generate these modulating patterns that change dramatically the haptic experience at the end, just with a few clicks. If we're happy, we can save it. And in this case, by sending it to player, what is going to happen? As we discussed, iPhone and Android, where this application to test exist, are responsive just to standard haptics. Our system automatically translates advanced haptics into standard. So you're going to experience the amplitude modulation of your signal. To be able to experience the final, let's say, HD response, you will need to have included in our SDK and in Unity an HD device. For example, a Sound2Haptics device or a custom device that you implemented in our InterHaptics engine. And at that stage, you will be able to experience the final haptics. This will become more and more easy in the future where we integrate more devices into the haptics composer. But at this stage, it requires the implementation of the HD haptics device into the InterHaptics player. Sorry, InterHaptics engine. I think that at this stage, I give you a full tour about the basics for the haptics composer. Let's create a new material and let's discover the other two perceptions that we have on top right here. Let's call it beta textures, this material. We leave it in standard because it's okay. We save it into the desktop, and let's go. We add a texture. The texture has the same output as a vibrotactile. The difference is that it's represented in space, not in time. So when you add your node, you will need to displace your finger, for example, on the player to fill the texture. But all the design patterns and design properties are exactly the same. So everything you learn for the vibrotactile will still apply for the texture. Let's cancel this perception just by selecting it and cancel it, and let's go to stiffness. Stiffness is the haptics perception that is useful for force feedback devices like a Samsung Glove or like, for example, PlayStation 5 kinesthetic trigger. So in this stage, again, you see a really familiar way to define a force response profile in function of what? In function of the displacement. So you have unitary displacement on the bottom. It has no units, and it has the maximum amplitude of the force feedback. So everything you learn about keyframes still applies for the stiffness design. So you can select your keyframe, you can define X position and Y position. Let's imagine that you want it at the top at this stage. And you define your force profile that will be felt by the user while displacing its finger on the device. So this gives a really nice tour of the haptic composer. So you can log out here from your account and log in with a new one. In the project, you can define standard or advanced. We have help with documentation, keyboard shortcuts, tutorial, onboarding, and the community. So during the beta, we will work a lot in the community. So join the Discord community. You can test it to the haptics player. You have a multiple shortcut to go back and modify your material.